right. So first and foremost, I want to take a second to introduce Gonzalo. Gonzalo is a UI engineer at CrowdStrike with 10 years of experience as a UI engineer. And as a frame of reference, that would be 2012, where you first began. And that's when Ember was called Amber at that point in time, as well as Backbone at that period in time was one of the first frameworks that started to move away from jQuery. And at this point in time, 10 years ago, there the same way that we have the term UI engineer, that didn't really exist 10 years ago when you first started. So I, you know, just to put that in perspective, Gonzalo's been in the game for a minute. And I just wanted to say that. Do you want to take a second to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, hi, my name is Gonzalo. I'm from Portugal. I used to live in London, but now I'm living in Lyon in France. And yeah, as Jai said, I've been working as a web developer slash UI engineer for 10, 11 years. At the time I started Jai, we didn't even use Backbone or anything like that. It was a custom framework built on top of Mood tools, very object oriented. Yeah, it was fun times.
Yeah, I'm sure. And I think like 10 years ago, browsers were drastically different too. Now browsers can have a lot of the similar capabilities, enabling our web applications to be much more like native applications by giving us like Bluetooth interactivity, push notifications, and much more. Um, but so this conversation is about pair programming, and on Twitter there was an essay that came out, and it was called "The Case Against Pair Programming," and that it really bothered me because the core tenet or the thesis of this mini essay was that pair programming is detrimental to organizations. And it's detrimental because this individual was saying is that it's forcing your expert engineer to become the same level as the lowest common denominator on your team, which I found to be rude and disrespectful in the first place. I didn't, and the other thing was that I felt like some of the points that were being made there to support the argument was that much of the activities that are done in pair programming are the same things that happen in code review. And personally, from my personal experience, it's never been that way. I think I'm pretty sure I've pair programmed now for nearly 1,000 hours. And I haven't come across that much of the time. So Gonzalo, I want to take a second, give you a chance to tell us about your experience with pair programming. You're a well thought out guy that reads quite well, and you have a few opinions. Some of them might be strong.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I do want to start by somewhat giving credit, like this tweet, if that is that person experience, it is value. They went through it, they felt that, and then they found a way to put it into words. So like their experience is valid. If this was not done just to stir up the pot, or if it was an honest opinion, it's their opinion and it's totally fine. But reading it feels like they focus too much on speed, and that speed from, if I understand correctly, it's like lines of code or features produced or something like that, which is it's definitely a metric, right? But is it the metric, especially lines of code, or how much code you output? Because he talks about output. You should have twice the output, right? Because you have two people, but it doesn't really work like that. You cannot get the typical man moth joke. You can't have 9 women giving birth to a baby in 1 month. This is not possible. So it's a similar thing. There's other dimensions to consider, and you mentioned a few. You mentioned about knowledge and about growth. So we can't just put this equation in terms of speed and lines of code. In terms of my experience, when I started, pair programming was not exactly a thing. It was not seen as a practice. I mean, it's been here since a really long time, especially since extreme programming made it a core practice and a core value. But it was not really something that I had to kind of after 5 or 6 years of working, and I kind of had to leave Portugal for that. When these practices start being more encouraged, and I started working on teams that valued more teamwork and discussion instead of you being a code monkey, which was what I felt a lot in Portugal. When you start being seen as an engineer and somebody that actually tackles hard problems, bringing a second opinion into the mix, it always helps. So whenever you work in a team or in a company that values that, then you start seeing that as a practice. And some teams will take that pairing as a 100%, but you don't need to have that in order to make it useful. And Jai, like with all those hours that you've had so far, I would say that in terms of practice, you're an expert on this. You probably know what to do, what not to do, what brings people together, and what helps.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to go into this, and I do think that one of the first things I do want to talk about is there's a power dynamic in pair programming, and from my perspective as the junior, I have a very particular feeling about how I ask for help, and just like the nervousness and anxiety that I feel when I ask about help. I think this is interesting in your situation because I know that you help with the one school that's in London for helping people try to break into tech. So there's different power dynamics that can occur from whether you look similar to the people who are on the team, whether you have the same experience level, whether you have experience in the type of programming that you're trying to contribute to. And I'm wondering, in your shoes, as someone who is quite highly sought out for pair programming outside of CrowdStrike and inside of CrowdStrike, what do you think makes people uncomfortable about pair programming?
So what you mentioned is quite important, that dynamic of different levels of expertise or experience. Nobody wants to ask quote unquote dumb questions or anything like that, and nobody wants to be made fun of, which unfortunately happens sometimes. But that's I feel like in that power dynamic, the senior developer needs to show the example. It needs to set the tone. It needs to create psychological safety so that the other person, any question is valid. And whenever I use a term that you don't understand, whenever I say MVP or, whenever I say that, just then it's up to the person, interrupt me on the spot or write it down. And then at the end, ask me all the things that I ask, because I cannot read your mind. You cannot read my mind. So sometimes I might be going on a tangent, explaining something that you have no context about. So the person that is confused should be the first one to be like, hey, I don't understand. And the person that's talking and explaining something, you can gain the muscle as you program and as you pair with other people. You can work that muscle of making sure we're in the same page. Like, do you know about this? No? Okay, let me take a step back and tell you about this, because we'll need it for what I'm going to explain.
Yeah. So, let's play a little thought experiment. I want to double tap on psychological safety. So I've referred a few junior engineers to Daniela, one of the engineering managers at CrowdStrike. Now imagine one of these individuals is starting on Monday, and they reach out to you for pair programming. As soon as the Zoom session starts, or even before the Zoom session starts, what steps are you taking as a more experienced engineer and someone who's already on the CrowdStrike team? What are you going to do to create that environment of psychological safety, both in Slack, during the call, talking to that person's manager? Could you tell us what steps you're going to take to make that environment?
Yeah, I could tell you what we do in our product group. So we know beforehand who's going to join and when, and we try to pair them with a buddy. And that person will be, at least for the first few weeks or first few months, the first person in contact that you'll have. As whenever you have questions, that's the person that you're going to ask. Even if that person doesn't know how to answer, they'll be the one figuring out the answers for you or with you. So you always have one point of contact instead of being kind of overwhelmed by all these 50, 60 people you have on your team. And another aspect that I find curious, at least at CrowdStrike, that I didn't have in other companies, is that there's a lot to read. There's a lot to watch. There's a lot of context that you need to kind of absorb when you start. And the first thing that I tell them is that, like, it's okay. Nobody expects you to be productive for the first few months. There's a lot to read. You're going to have so many questions. That's totally normal. You're going to feel like this is too much. That's totally normal. It's not. You'll get there. And whenever you have questions, we're happy to jump in on Zooms, helping you start with the first pull request, setting up credentials. There's so much thing to set up as well. And every time a new person joins, the process is a bit different. So there's documentation that's always a tiny bit behind, so you can't just, oh, here's the manual, please read it. You start with that, but then you're like, read it, we're here, there are going to be mistakes, and we're here to solve them with you. And you're not alone on taking all this in. And this is just even before you start writing code. So even before you start writing code, we're the first ones to say, it's going to be complicated. It's going to be a lot of questions. There's a lot of context. So we're here, and we'll get into a call whenever you need.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And I love what Celia just wrote in the chat, saying that she likes to tell her team, there's no such thing as stupid questions. It's all about context. Yeah. You're just missing context. And it sounds very similar where, on your front, having the buddy system in one point of contact rather than like a one-to-many relationship can be really good for just streamlining who you're going to ask and making sure that that person has the bandwidth to continue responding to you. And then the next thing is managing expectations and, giving that person a timeline saying, hey, for the first few months, it's not that big of a deal. And then also taking a second to recognize how this could be a learning opportunity for the organization to upgrade their documentation, because if documentation gets very stale, it makes for a bad situation where knowledge starts to become tribal. So I think that's pretty good. So now let's continue the thought experiment. I'm working on my first ticket, and I'm brand new to Ember, and I don't even know how to communicate what issues that I'm facing. I'm supposed to just work on some presentational component, and I'm working. I'm in my controller. I'm trying to, create some type of variable that my template will then have access to, but I'm not seeing it, and I don't even know how to communicate this problem. So now I'm posting an SOS in Slack saying, hey, I've been blocked for 2 hours on this ticket. What do? I don't even know how to explain where I'm going wrong. How do you come in and diffuse that situation?
Mm-hmm. So if somebody's been blocked on something for 2 hours, the first thing I ask is like, don't stay 2 hours on this. It's 15 minutes, 30 minutes. Like there's no, it's not worth to just spend hours on something just for the personal satisfaction or something. It's just there's someone that you can bring in, and in 5 minutes, they'll fix your problem. They'll teach you so much. Like in 5 minutes, you're just going to feel like you've made such a huge progress, and you're going to look at those 2 hours and feel, I've wasted all that time. I could have just solved it like this if I just brought the right person. So that's the first thing I tell them for the future. Just hop on a call with me or someone else from the team. And as somebody said, Celia said, context. It's all about context. Sometimes in this case, there was missing Ember context, right? I don't know. And I felt the same when I joined CrowdStrike. I have all this view context. Then when I went to Ember, I was trying to follow that context or what I've learned on that context, and things didn't work. And the technical example that you gave is really good. So somebody jumps in and one of two things would happen. Either you're kind of good already in pairing, and the first thing you know what to do is to tell the other person what you're trying to do and what you've done so far, so then you don't have to kind of repeat the same steps. And as the person trying to help, you ask that from them, like, okay, what are you trying to do? Okay, got it. So I know where we should go. What have you done so far? Like, guide me through the steps. Because a lot of times, if in that case, when there's somebody not experienced in Ember and somebody experienced, as soon as they start showing the steps, like, oh, I know where the model broke. And then there's a knowledge gap there that you can fill in because this person doesn't have it yet. I have it. And this is I would say the best thing about pair programming when done right. It's identifying these knowledge gaps and just communicate enough that you bridge them. And that's what that paper, the 400 and something pages, that's what the paper focused on about. We know that pair programming helps with knowledge transfer. How? Like what happens? How do you make it more efficient? How do you prevent that knowledge sharing from breaking, etc.?
Yeah. Awesome. And this really ties on to another point that I've been seeing lately. It's that, are you a coach or are you a consultant? And there's a very big difference between both of these personas. A consultant is someone that just tells you what the solution is. A coach, interestingly enough, when you ask a coach a question, they ask you a question in return. But the good thing about it is that you're showing the person, hey, you already have most of the things that you already need within you. And especially because you've already vetted this person, you've hired them, you don't need to just give them the answer. Sometimes you just need to prod them with a few questions so that they know how to find these things on their own. And it sounds like, a lot of times that's, as a senior engineer, that's a skill set that you don't realize because I'm someone who desires to become a senior engineer one day. And, right now in this phase, I'm really focusing on execution and increasing my technical scope. But it sounds like at that next stage, it really is much more about communication and collaboration and guiding someone to the correct answer rather than just kind of giving it to them so that they can find it on their own. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I've actually never thought it or never heard it about those names for those personas, but they match a lot with my experience. And I do find myself a lot in the situation of coach. And sometimes in your personal life can be very annoying when somebody just wants an answer out of you and you're just like, if you had to guess, what would you say it is? Just to see if they have a good instinct. But in the professional context, I think that's exactly how you do it. And a lot of times when I pair with more junior elements of the team and they are stuck on something, they have kind of everything right. There's just like one thing there that is just not working. And you can just jump in, you're very busy, you can just jump in and okay, that's your problem. And then you can just get out of the call, or you can just stay there and build rapport and kind of guide the person towards that kind of missing piece and see if they can fix it, if they can identify, if they can fix it, if they understand what was wrong, because if they do, that is just so much more powerful and it will stay in your memory better than if somebody just jumped in and gave you your answer. Because the next time it happens, if that is the path you follow, that person probably won't remember. So it'll just go to you and ask you exactly the same question. And then you'll just be like, oh, just don't do that. Just build this bad rapport that you can fix with just putting a bit more time and effort and helping that person become more, like they'll also get more satisfaction out of just like, oh yeah, I found it. I had everything right. And again, what Celia said, I was just missing some context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I really like that. And what I'll close with before we go into the actual Q&A portion is that, having the ability to ask a question to someone else's question does still require a good sense of technical communication so that you're asking the person, hey, what do you think is happening in the execution context? Or, you know, for this route, you know, what other entities is this route related to? Because you want to have good technical communication to the point where when you communicate, you can get someone else unblocked without writing the code for them. And that's something that I'm personally striving to do. I also love what Mihal is saying in the chat. You know, as a senior engineer on the CrowdStrike team, he tries to really draw attention to the mistakes that he's making, because then it normalizes the fact that we make mistakes. And so, wrapping up on the main thread here before we go into the Q&A, the big things here that we've talked about is, you know, having a fleshed out process, knowing who's going to join, having one buddy for that person, so it is a one-to-one relationship as opposed to one-to-many, which will streamline who they go to and build some sense of trust. Then the next thing is, from day one, setting what the expectations are for what ramp should look like, and then being able to make sure that that person understands what some team norms are for what to do when they're stuck on a bug. And then lastly, it is making sure that your senior engineers or your more experienced engineers have the mindset of a coach, not a consultant. So instead of just giving an answer to a question, responding to a question with a question by way of having good, strong technical communication that can get someone else unblocked.